Chapter 10 of Mathilda. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Corey Samuel. Mathilda by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. Chapter 10. It was 6 months after this miserable conclusion to his long-nursed hopes that I first saw him. He had retired to a part of the country where he was not known, that he might peacefully indulge his grief. All the world, by the death of his beloved Eleanor, was changed to him, and he could no longer remain in any spot where he had seen her, or where her image mingled with the most rapturous hopes had brightened all around with a light of joy, which would now be transformed to a darkness blacker than midnight, since she, the sun of his life, was set for ever. He lived for some time never looking on the light of heaven, but shrouding his eyes in a perpetual darkness far from all that could remind him of what he had been. But as time softened his grief, like a true child of nature, he sought in the enjoyment of her beauties for a consolation in his unhappiness. He came to a part of the country where he was entirely unknown, and where in the deepest solitude he could converse only with his own heart. He found a relief to his impatient grief in the breezes of heaven and in the sound of waters and woods. He became fond of riding. This exercise distracted his mind and elevated his spirits. On a swift horse he could for a moment gain respite from the image that else for ever followed him. Eleanor on her deathbed, her sweet features changed, and the soft spirit that animated her gradually waning into extinction. For many months Woodville had in vain endeavoured to cast off this terrible remembrance. It still hung on him until memory was too great a burden for his loaded soul. But when on horseback the spell that seemingly held him to this idea was snapped. Then, if he thought of his lost bride, he pictured her radiant in beauty, he could hear her voice and fancy her a sylvan huntress by his side, while his eyes brightened as he thought he gazed on her cherished form. I had several times seen him ride across the heath, and felt angry that my solitude should be disturbed. It was so long since I had spoken to any but peasants, that I felt a disagreeable sensation at being gazed on by one of superior rank. I feared also that it might be some one who had seen me before. I might be recognized, my impostures discovered, and I dragged back to a life of worse torture than that I had before endured. These were dreadful fears, and they even haunted my dreams. I was one day seated on the verge of the clump of pines, when Woodville rode past. As soon as I perceived him, I suddenly rose to escape from his observation by entering among the trees. My rising startled his horse, he reared and plunged, and the rider was at length thrown. The horse then galloped swiftly across the heath, and the stranger remained on the ground, stunned by his fall. He was not materially hurt, a little fresh water soon recovered him. I was struck by his exceeding beauty, and as he spoke to thank me, the sweet but melancholy cadence of his voice brought tears into my eyes. A short conversation passed between us, but the next day he again stopped at my cottage, and by degrees an intimacy grew between us. It was strange to him to see a female in extreme youth, I was not yet 20, evidently belonging to the first classes of society, and possessing every accomplishment an excellent education could bestow, living alone on a desolate heath. One on whose forehead the impress of grief was strongly marked, and whose words and motions betrayed that her thoughts did not follow them, but were intent on far other ideas, bitter and overwhelming miseries. I was dressed also in a whimsical nun-like habit which denoted that I did not retire to solitude from necessity, but that I might indulge in a luxury of grief and fanciful seclusion. He soon took great interest in me, and sometimes forgot his own grief to sit beside me and endeavour to cheer me. He could not fail to interest even one who had shut herself from the whole world, whose hope was death, and who lived only with the departed. His personal beauty, his conversation which glowed with imagination and sensibility, the poetry that seemed to hang upon his lips and to make the very air mute to listen to him, were charms that no one could resist. He was younger, less worn, more passionless than my father, and in no degree reminded me of him. He suffered under immediate grief, yet its gentle influence, instead of calling feelings otherwise dormant into action, seemed only to veil that which otherwise would have been too dazzling for me. When we were together I spoke little, yet my selfish mind was sometimes borne away by the rapid course of his ideas. I would lift my eyes with momentary brilliancy, until memories that never died, and seldom slept, would recur, and a tear would dim them. Woodville for ever tried to lead me to the contemplation of what is beautiful and happy in the world. His own mind was constitutionally bent to a former belief in good rather than in evil, and this feeling, which must even exhilarate the hopeless, ever shone forth in his words. He would talk of the wonderful powers of man, of their present state and of their hopes, of what they had been and what they were, and when reason could no longer guide him, his imagination, as if inspired, shed light on the obscurity that veils the past and the future. He loved to dwell on what might have been the state of the earth before man lived on it, and how he first arose and gradually became the strange, complicated, but as he said, the glorious creature he now is, covering the earth with their creations, and forming by the power of their minds another world more lovely than the visible frame of things, even all the world that we find in their writings. A beautiful creation, he would say, which may claim this superiority to its model, that good and evil is more easily separated, the good rewarded in the way they themselves desire, the evil punished as all things evil ought to be punished, not by pain, which is revolting to all philanthropy to consider, but by quiet obscurity, which simply deprives them of their harmful qualities. Why kill the serpent when you have extracted his fangs? The poetry of his language and ideas, which my words ill convey, held me enchained to his discourses. It was a melancholy pleasure to me to listen to his inspired words, to catch for a moment the light of his eyes, to feel a transient sympathy, and then to awaken from the delusion, again to know that all this was nothing, a dream, a shadow, for that there was no reality for me. My father had for ever deserted me, leaving me only memories, which set an eternal barrier between me and my fellow creatures. I was indeed fellow to none. He, Woodville, mourned the loss of his bride, others wept the various forms of misery as they visited them, but infamy and guilt was mingled with my portion. Unlawful and detestable passion had poured its poison into my ears and changed all my blood, so that it was no longer the kindly stream that supports life, but a cold fountain of bitterness, corrupted in its very source. It must be the excess of madness that could make me imagine that I could ever be aught but one alone, struck off from humanity, bearing no affinity to man or woman, a wretch on whom nature had set her ban. Sometimes Woodville talked to me of himself. He related his history, brief in happiness and woe, and dwelt with passion on his and Eleanor's mutual love She was.